We are live, we can start.
So hello and welcome everyone to the next sixth session on the South Asian landscapes organized by the School of Environment and Architecture. Today we have two talks by two distinguished scholars on South Asia to kind of just introduce you to the symposium. So far, the School of Environment and Architecture has been organizing these talks since 2014 under its public outreach. And this particular series is something that we started this semester. We've already had 5 talks. This is the sixth talk. The whole idea was to start looking at the South Asian region. And it came from our own sort of pedagogical search where we realized that we don't really have an archive to really look at South Asian landscapes through. And that's when we started a research vertical in the school, looking at very carefully the region around. The students got involved in building an archive. We started building our library. But this particular session, we have invited important scholars, practitioners, to think together with us on the idea of the South Asian landscape. So here is, we have two important scholars. Let me introduce you to Professor Dr. Ranjith Dayaratne. I think one of the most important things to understand here is that he looks at the idea of vernacular architecture through this idea of world views that it brings. Right? Previously in the series, we've had Professor Kazi Ashraf, who also came in, who spoke about this idea of life worlds that architecture generates. And I think that is something that is important to understand. And his lecture is called Vernacular Architecture of South Asia and its Spatial Logics, because to understand that in some ways architecture as we know it comes from certain ways of looking at logics of engagement and logics of working, and often these are seen as neutral spaces. Yeah, and so the kind of architecture that we then engage in the contemporary sometimes comes from those kind of neutral ways of looking at things. But here's Professor Dayaratne, who's kind of coming to us with the idea that the vernacular should be seen through the idea of its own logics. Yeah, and I think that is something that we're really looking forward to. He also places the idea of the vernacular within the idea of other cultural practices, comparing them with the food we eat, the clothes we wear, our art, our own social practices. So architecture doesn't remain in some ways as an object, but it becomes a kind of set of practices. And I think that is something that we are really excited about and looking forward to. Um, I'm going to read his bio because it's a long, illustrious bio. Dr. Ranjith Dayaratne is an associate professor at the Department of Architecture and Interior Design at the University of Bahrain. He has been a visiting research scholar and tutor at the University of Melbourne, Australia, and a senior lecturer at the University of Moratoa, Sri Lanka. The Commonwealth Scholar and a Fellow of Commonwealth Understanding in 1995. He was the former secretary of the Sri Lanka Institute of Architects. He was also the founder chairperson of the board of architectural publications of SLIA, and has edited the Sri Lanka Architect Journal and founded and edited the Built Environment Sri Lanka and Vastu journals. He's currently editing the International Society for Study of Vernacular Settlements, a journal, and Cities, People, Places, an international journal on urban design for the University of Moratoa, Sri Lanka. So I think, I mean, it sort of, goes on, but I think what is really sort of interesting is the amount of research and publications that he's been engaged in. And we're very, very happy to invite him in this symposium to open up for us the logics through which vernacular architecture has been looked at. I'm going to introduce the second speaker as well, because we go back to back with the talks. And after the talks, we will open up the question and answer session. We're also kind of requesting you to put your questions in the Q&A box here, where you'll find at the bottom of the screen. So our next speaker is Dr. Narein Perera. And again, one of the interesting things in this talk is that he locates his research and his practice in the space of the mega city and its kind of rampant growth and the urbanization that happens. But he sort of starts thinking carefully about this idea of what does it mean to build sustainably at the scale of the settlement and at the scale of the building. And how do we sort of ameliorate the impact of rapid urbanization to think of the idea of future sustainability? So I think, again, very important, and it'll also be interesting to look at both the talks together and the frameworks that they sort of open up for us. And so Dr. Narein Perera he has a architectural practice and has won recognition for design both locally and internationally. He critically explores the impacts of haphazard rapid development in tropical cities. His research includes a local climate zone based approach to urban planning in Colombo, Sri Lanka. On building scale, he works on the idea of passive design and the idea of thermal comfort and energy efficiency. He's also an author, team member for the development of energy efficient building code for Sri Lanka. So again, two very interesting speakers here. And I would invite Professor Ranjith Dayaratne to come and present his lecture. I'm going to switch off my I'm going to mute myself and stop my video so that we don't have people me flashing on the screen. And if I could also request Narein to switch off your video, because if we can, and then you can switch on your video again when you come into the presentation. So thank you so much, both of you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rupali Gupta. Can you all hear me?
Yes, very well.
That's great. Thank you very much, Professor Rupali Gupta. I'm delighted this afternoon to be talking about the topic that I have been asked to talk about. And to begin with, I would like to thank the School of Environment and Architecture, Professor Rupali Gupta and Dr. Anush Daga for the coordination that they did in the process of getting to this position, this talk. I'm delighted for the invitation and thank you very much. Particularly, I'm happy because despite the fact that I come from South Asia as a region, I haven't really been thinking about South Asia as itself. Like Professor Rupali Gupta said, I think we have ignored ourselves looking deep into South Asia region as such. I've been involved in Vernacular for almost 20 years and looking at Southeast Asia and South Asia and so on and so forth. But this is the first time I've been made to really rethink about how Vernacular in the South Asia itself, if there is any logic that exists and how itself comes into being. So this is a great opportunity, and I hope I can make sense of the big region through this within the 30 minutes time that is available to us. But that's a huge task, but nevertheless, let me try. I would go on this presentation in a systematic manner, from giving an introduction to vernacular architecture to begin with, and then trying to figure out how vernacular architecture could be located in the context of the South Asian region, whether there is any possibility of looking at commonalities across the region as such. And then I'll try to locate the spatial logics. What is the logical framework from which South Asian vernacular architecture comes into being, if there is anything at all in that sort of sense. In order to do that, despite the fact that we are looking at South Asia, and my experience with South Asia is somewhat limited, although I have traveled to Nepal and Bhutan and so on and so forth, and I have looked at some of the things, but I don't claim to be able to look at the entire South Asia region in depth. And therefore, what I've done and chosen to do is to look at the Sri Lankan context in detail, and then try and derive insights from the Sri Lankan context, which I believe could be projected across to the South Asian region to a certain extent. So I will try and unearth the core characteristics of the vernacular settlements of Sri Lanka, and then from that try and present the logics of South Asian vernacular architecture, which can be bundled together and therefore can be called as South Asian spatial logics of South Asian vernacular architecture. I think most of us are familiar with vernacular architecture in general sense, but I think a small introduction will be useful. On the left, you have images, popular common images of vernacular, which are interesting to look at, which are rich in terms of way in which things are put together and manifested, and then present visually and spatially as well. Vernacular is referred to as what is made by the people themselves without professional intervention. And then for that reason, actually speaking, if you look at the history of architecture, history of the world really, human civilization, vernacular is the beginning of the human civilization. When the man who was a hunter stopped and then decided to locate in a single location and find a shelter in natural caves and so on, the first acts of vernacular came into being. And then from that point onwards, of course, vernacular has evolved, and we are now today in the world of professional architectural reconstructed work, but vernacular is the origin. Vernacular is not just confined to settlements and architecture and shelters, but it exists and it comes into being in almost all activities of the people. We can talk about vernacular talk. We talk professionally, like when we are talking now, and we talk in a vernacular way when we talk on an everyday situation. So that's how vernacular exists. We have vernacular art, we have vernacular music, we have even vernacular medicine. People are today talking about COVID-19 and there is no cure. And lots of people are saying, well, there is a traditional vernacular ways in which this can be dealt with. And there's a huge argument going on that, the value of the vernacular medicine and how we are ignoring that knowledge that has been amassed over the past in the human civilization. We have vernacular food, vernacular clothing, things that people make for themselves. We cook at home and that's vernacular food. And we buy food from shops and restaurants and that's not vernacular anymore. So this is how vernacular is related to the whole idea of being of the people, made by the people. Architecture is first and foremost vernacular in that sense. The term vernacular comes from, interestingly, from a Latin word called verna, meaning home-born slave, and vernaculus, meaning domestic or native. This is the connection to the residential buildings and the origin of belonging to a particular location, native. Vernacular is closely associated with traditional, but it is not necessarily only traditional. There is traditional architecture, which is not vernacular, which is involving other builders and professionals and so on and so forth. But vernacular is very closely associated with traditional and synonymous with various other terms like authentic, native, tribal, folklore, homemade, and so on and so forth. Despite all of these things, vernacular has not drawn that much of scholarly attention, although there are a lot of works that have been done by architects such as Professor Paul Oliver and Amos Rappaport and so on and so forth, but it doesn't draw that much attention. 75 to 80% of the world's population lives in vernacular houses, according to the statistics that have been derived in the 1980s by Professor Paul Oliver, and I think the numbers are very similar even now. Then let me move on to the common characteristics of the South Asia within which the vernacular architecture of South Asia exists, and therefore we should be able to see how it is possible to construct spatial logics of vernacular in the region together or not. I looked at South Asia for the first time interestingly, because of this particular involvement. And I realized that it's a geographical and ethno-cultural entity. Nevertheless, it's very diverse. India being the biggest geographical mass, it is the anchoring part of South Asia, and therefore it's also called the Indian subcontinent. It comprises, nevertheless, only 3% of the Earth's land area, but 25% of the world's population. So what it means is that it's a hugely populated region. It's diverse climates and diverse cultures. 98% of the global Hindus live there, 90% of Sikhs, 30% of Muslims, 35 million Christians. So it's religiously diverse, culturally diverse. Common cultural characteristics nevertheless come into being in the region from culture, affinity to religions in particular, and that their role in daily life. There are linguistic similarities, despite the fact that there are a huge number of languages across the region. Cuisine such as rice and curry is common across the region. So there are similarities. Yet another interesting similarity comes from the fact that South Asia has, almost all of South Asia has been under British colonialism, and English has been our second language. And that has given us certain kinds of ways of thinking and relating and understanding the world. There is overriding economic poverty across the region. In 2019, on average, 66% of the people in South Asia lived in villages. Although in some countries it was more, it is more. In fact, in Sri Lanka, it is 80%. In India, it is 72%. In Maldives, 0%. Almost everyone lives in cities. But it's hugely rural as a settlement region. Rural habits are mostly vernacular settlements. That is the bottom line. So we are talking about South Asia, and the moment we are talking about South Asia and architecture, we are in fact talking about vernacular settlements in which huge majority of the people live. But there is another dichotomy here as well. South Asia is also a region to 8 megacities with 20 to 60 billion people. So there is another part of South Asia which is not vernacular in general sense, but I'll come back to this. It is, again, relatively vernacular as well, even though they are megacities. Now, when we come to talk about vernacular, like I was saying, and I've been implying in the previous talk, that 80% of the people live in the villages are vernacular, and so on. That is the general perception, that vernacular is almost always associated with the rural, but that is not necessarily true. There are two parts of vernacular. There is a rural vernacular and there is urban vernacular. Urban vernacular is not always looked at positively. Rural vernacular is always valued. It's cherished, it's admired. Tourists travel to places to see them, and we like to take pictures, and there are a lot of beautiful images about the rural vernacular, but not of the urban vernacular. Urban vernacular exists in almost all those 8 mega cities in the South Asian region. They are not valued either by the insiders. Even the people who are living in those vernacular in the cities don't like them. The governments don't like them. Outsiders don't like them either. They are despised by both insiders and outsiders. But that's not the situation with the rural vernacular. Rural vernacular is beautiful to look at, nice to live in, appreciated, valued, cherished, and attempted to be preserved as well. And there's a lot of support to rural vernacular, but not urban vernacular. So there is a dichotomy about vernacular in South Asia. I think it is the case with other parts of the world as well. Urban vernacular is considered culturally poor, corrupted, and constructed by ad hocism, whereas rural vernacular is considered culturally rich and driven by tradition. This is how vernacular exists in South Asia. Let's go and look at the rural vernacular. The vernacular rural is a generation that has come into being primarily on the reactions that man has made in trying to translate and transform the geographical terrain into livable habitats. So geography and the terrain has a huge influence on the vernacular in the rural, and it affects as to how the space is defined and forms are constructed upon it. Then on top of that, the climate. Of course, in South Asia, the climate varies from the cold climates to the temperate climate and so on and so forth. There is a wide variety of climatic conditions. But whatever that climatic condition is, the microclimate of the region has a huge influence on the vernacular of the rural areas. Worldviews, that's this important aspect of the vernacular. That is what people think about what the world really is and how it is constituted of. As physical elements and as spiritual existence in that physical world, and what is the position of man and what are you doing in the middle of all of those relationships that have come into being. That view is central and fundamental to the production of space and form, and that comes also from religious beliefs, in fact. So the core of the worldviews actually is originated in the religious beliefs. People have a huge variety of religious beliefs across South Asia. And from that arises the worldviews, and from that arises the ideas and practices of the people as to what they do on a daily basis and what they do in terms of ceremonies and rituals and how they perform daily life activities and so on and so forth. And these constantly happening across years and years and years gives rise to what we call the traditions, which are handed down practices and ideas and beliefs, which influences the way we build, and the way we occupy, and the way we live. Then the rural vernacular is also affected and originated by the materials that are present in the landscape, in the surrounding immediate vicinity. And that's the bottom line about vernacular always. It depends on what is in the surrounding. So materials come from the region, come from the immediate surroundings, and we see timber, mud, stones, and thatch, tejan, leaves, and so on and so forth, which are part and parcel of the vernacular of the rural. Then, of course, the skills and technologies of the people. People have developed skills related to the transformation of those materials into sufficiently long-lasting components of buildings, which can house sufficiently sophisticated spaces for people to live in. I will emphasize on the idea of sufficiently sophisticated because that there is a very important and interesting dimension about the transformation of the materials. In the vernacular, materials are transformed only adequate to survive and sustain the living in a temporary sort of manner. And they are not necessarily intended to last long. And that is a very interesting aspect of vernacular in the rural areas. In contrast to this, we come to the urban vernacular, which is diametrically the opposite, unfortunately. In the cities, in the 8 megacities that we were being told that exist in South Asia, there are huge numbers of people who are living in places and spaces which have been constructed by themselves in ad hoc manner, in spaces that are left over in the city rather than occupied or owned by these people. This is the condition that gives rise to the derelict, uncherishable kind of conditions of the urban vernacular. The poverty of the urban vernacular comes from these two facts, that they are constructed in leftover spaces and they're constructed in spaces that don't belong to the people themselves. And then on top of that, the poverty of the people, the economic poverty, that they are doing jobs just to survive on a daily basis. And then that results in intellectual poverty because it doesn't provide them opportunities for education and so on and so forth. So poverty across intellectual, social, cultural, and spiritual areas lead to the construction of what we now call slums and shanties that exist around many of the cities, particularly in places like in India and so on. The buildings are ad hoc constructions, agglomerations of materials that can be salvaged from surroundings. And then, of course, people are poor and therefore unable to maintain them. Workmanships are poor, lack of skill exists, overcrowding, social conflicts. But in the middle of all of these, there are some interesting things. The material poverty exists in the urban vernacular, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the spatiality is necessarily equally poor. There are interesting and nice spaces that exist, and that's how and why people can live in them, despite the fact that they are materially poor. And there are also traditions, although we don't see them. The traditions in the rural vernacular, the traditions have come down over a long period of passing down from one generation to another generation, influenced by worldviews, refined by spirituality, intellectuality, skills, and so on and so forth. But although it is not exactly the same in the city, in the urban vernacular, traditions come into being, that there is a way in which things are done, and there is culture that exists. But this culture is original in some sense, authentic, if you like, but not necessarily admirable. It lacks a certain kind of originality, of anchoring to values and resources, and therefore we could say that the culture is to a certain extent based on imitation. So there's a sharp contrast between the urban vernacular and rural vernacular that exists in the South Asian region. Now, given the fact that these two vernacular practices are different, very different, diametrically opposite, if you like, and given the fact that when we generally talk about vernacular, we are looking at rural vernacular, and given the fact that looking into both of them in a very short period of time is going to be very difficult, what I would do is to not necessarily go into the urban vernacular, because there isn't really, what we need to do about urban vernacular is entirely different from what we need to do about rural vernacular. From the rural vernacular, there are a lot of lessons to be learned for the contemporary world. Like I said, from many rural-based vernacular practices, there are a lot of indigenous intellectual, there is a lot of intellectual knowledge that can be gained, practices that can be repeated, techniques and technologies that can be reinvented for the modern world, but not necessarily, same cannot be said about urban vernacular. What we need to do in urban vernacular is to do it the other way around, use our own understanding to try and help and heal, if you like, the poverty of the urban vernacular. So it is an entirely different thing. For that reason, I wouldn't really go into looking at urban vernacular today. So I will look at the rural vernacular now in detail, closely at the Sri Lankan situation, which I'm really familiar with. So if it comes to Sri Lankan situation, as you know, probably Sri Lanka is an island of 25,000 or so villages, very green, plenty of forest and trees and waterways and so on and so forth. And the vernacular of the Sri Lanka and rural settlements have come into being on the basis of the geography that has existed there. The climate is rising in most of the parts, and then there is colder areas. Of course, the vernacular in that part is different. But nevertheless, largely speaking, in the dry zones and in the large majority of the country, there are a couple of elements that have influenced the production of the vernacular. So in fact, the identity of Sri Lanka as a nation is supposed to or derived from two elements. One is the Dagaba. As you know, Sri Lanka is a very Buddhist country, which comes from the temples, defines Sri Lankan identity along with the waterways, the water tanks, which are natural and artificial. And we say Vava and Dagaba, they are the two elements of the landscape that defines the Sri Lankan culture. And they are the ones that have actually fashioned also the vernacular settlements. Now, from these two comes a number of ideas. The final output of the vernacular practice is settlement, the settlement space in which people inhabit and live, called the Gamgodas. That has been the traditional, the age-old settlement place, surrounded by the agricultural spaces from which they derive the food necessary for survival, which was supported by the water that existed in the village tanks, and over which existed the Buddhist temple that provided the spiritual and intellectual nourishment and guidelines to exist in that space. Then, of course, there is the forest that provided the natural food and the presence of the other beings around them. So Sri Lankan vernacular settlement is typified by the worldview that has been generated by Buddhism, which advocates the acceptance of fragility of life. Life is so unpredictable, doesn't last, and no one has control. So this fragility is underneath the understanding about human existence in the Sri Lankan vernacular space. And that results in very simple existence, an emphasis on commonality of existence rather than individualism. And also the need to share things that the jungle or surrounding has provided, sharing it with other people, and not engage in worldly pleasures excessively. So there is subdued indulgence in worldly pleasures with modest self-expression. Self-expression is now very important in the village, in the rural settlement. And the emphasis is necessarily on striving for spiritual upliftment, which comes from the centrality of the Buddhist temple that exists in the settlement. There's a great sense of reverence for nature, and there's a great sense of respect for rights of other beings, meaning other people, animals, and other beings, insects, birds, and so on and so forth. There is a great sense of reverence and respect for those in the village, in the rural vernacular settlement, which all comes from the worldviews that have been infused through the presence of Buddhism and the temple as the center of the settlement. And then, of course, there is tolerance and compassion that makes people do what they do. This is the nature of the vernacular settlements in the Sri Lankan context. I will go and look at a little bit in detail about the way in which another dimension of this human settlement space can be looked at. Coming from Buddhism as a worldview, the peasant who lives in the village looks at the entire settlements as defined as two entities of sacred and the profane world. So the sacred is where the temple exists naturally. Of course, we all know that religions are sacred, and therefore Buddhist temple is the sacred space, and therefore the ground on which the temple exists is sacred. But interestingly, for the village peasant, it is not only the temple that is sacred. For the village peasant, the paddy field is also sacred. And more importantly, in the paddy field, the kamata is sacred as well. Because it is the paddy field and the kamata, meaning the threshing floor, where the paddy is harvested and threshed. That place and the paddy field, together with the temple, all of them are sacred. I say this because there is a specific thing that happens in terms of how you react, relate, and deal with these three localities, these spaces, the temple spaces, paddy field, and the threshing floor. Then, of course, you have, in comparison, in opposition to that, the profane world, the world in which people live, the inhabited spaces, which comprises of the house and the homestead. In between exists the jungle, the river and the waterways, and the agricultural area. This is the way in which the Sri Lankan landscape is conceptualized by the peasant. We go and look at the temples, the ethereal places, as we can call it. The temple is the first, and then it is spiritual and public as well. There are no other public spaces, really speaking. Everything public that happens in the temple, and the temple is the heart of the village. The kamata and the paddy field comes next. Again, there is ritual there is sanctity, there are reverence, there are spirituality and blessings. In fact, the language of expression changes in these two locations as opposed to the home and the homestead. The everyday talk, like you go and you walk and you eat and so on and so forth, has different words when it comes to the temple. And it has different words for doing these things or referring to these things in the threshing floor as well. This is because that's a sacred place as well. So paddy fields are on the lower ground, threshing floors are at the lower ground, yet sacred. And then the temples are generally on the high grounds or located in unique landscapes or transformed from natural settings so that it gives a certain degree of mysticism, and thereby acquire a sense of sacredness through the physical elements that exist in the landscape as well. When it comes to the paddy fields, the terracing, the way in which they are formed and related, like I said, attempt to try and transform as little as necessary for human existence and not to overdo, overindulge, overconsume, and so on. That's how the ethereal spaces exist in the village. Now we come to the inhabited spaces. The inhabited spaces have been always a cleared ground in the middle of the jungles, sandy raw earth yards, which are called medulla, surrounds the village houses. And there is the significance of the social and collective spaces. Often the houses are in clusters. If and when the terrain permits, there are individual houses, and then again they are connected with each other. There's an insignificance of individualism. Like I said before, sharing is a major facet. Houses are small, simple, and unsophisticated, comprised of few window spaces and much larger verandas and outdoor spaces. Life is lived, shared outdoors in close proximity to others. Simple. And outdoors plays a huge role in this activity, in this definition of space, creating the different types of spaces, under spaces, side spaces, on spaces, between spaces, and in spaces. Most spaces and places are outdoors, unbuilt, minimally transformed to facilitate doing things like meeting or observing or performing some ritual is under trees, or bathing by the side of a natural waterfall, or a peel or some kind of a sprout that has been created by that, or bathing on terraces and wells, walkways in between spaces like fences, footpaths on embankments of paddy terraces, and so on and so forth. So outdoors plays a huge role, and the definition of indoor is minimal. Constructed indoors are few. Rooms have small windows, implying that there is a significance of the outdoors. And then, of course, we have the in-between space, the verandas opening to the medullas or the yards with sandy terraces and the natural surroundings. Courtyards are very common, 2 sets of built rooms, and then you have a courtyard in between. A place for doing anything is any open space where you can lay a mat, and then it is transformed into an occupational space. I'll go quickly to the core characteristics of the rural vernacular settlements. Like I said, I'm repeating to a certain extent: affinity with religion and celebration of the sacred, modest indulgence in worldly pleasures, reluctance for overproduction and consumption is characteristics of the vernacular. And there is hesitation to waste and desire for saving for the future. There are a lot of practices in the rural homesteads where things are saved for tomorrow, and reverence for nature is predominant. The care and respect for the fauna and flora are present. Reverence and care for the land as a shared community exists, and people and other animals. To give you an example, when people cultivate paddy, the one patch of paddy will be left, not for the consumption of the people, but for the consumption of the birds. Understanding that the birds exist and they need to eat, they need to survive, and they need food, and then man has to provide that part. So paddy fields are typically viewed in that way, not as just portions of agricultural lands for individual personal gain only. The other beings are being taken care of. As a result of it, there is elaborate and articulate construction of the sacred, but unpretentious and rudimentary buildings for the profit. People don't build very extravagant buildings. They are very modest. Moderate production and use of appropriation of space. And materials are reused. Everything is reused whenever it is possible. And construction is always in harmony with nature and least damage possible. Allotment of land is based on community benefit rather than for collective, individual gain. It's always for collective benefit. Right. So this is the way in which Sri Lankan vernacular settlement is created. And if we look at this, and I think it should be possible, despite the fact that, like I said, South Asia is a diverse region from Nepal and Bhutan in the north to India and Sri Lanka in the south and Bangladesh on the east and Afghanistan to the west. It's diverse. It's hugely different from one region to another region. Geographies are diverse, climates are diverse, religious affiliations are diverse as well. However, I think there is a possibility to find some commonality across these regions. There is maybe some common spatial logics of the South Asian vernacular, and I thought I will list some of them which I could locate. One of them is reverence to nature, treating the earth gently. And then we have the affiliation to religion and deriving all spatial order from spiritual inspirations, whether it is Islam, whether it is Hinduism, whether it is Buddhism, you derive your spatial order from the teachings of religion. And then there is the celebration of the spirit of communality against individual exhibition. There are no massive, exorbitant structures for individual personal expressions, but there are for sacred religious places. So they create simple and unpretentious but soul-touching spaces for habitation and construct elaborate, grand, and soul-elevating spaces for the reverence of the sacred. I think these are the characteristics if you want to be looking at spatial logics of the vernacular South Asia. I will leave you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dayaratne, for this talk. We'll come back to the discussion. I think you've opened up several things for us, and a very interesting, very systematic sort of way of going about it. I will invite Dr. Narein Perera to come in for his talk, and we'll come back to the discussion for both the talks together at the end of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of SEA's initiative in bringing South Asia together. I'm also very pleased to go after my teacher, Professor Ranjith Dayaratne, who has taught me at the University of Moratuwa many years ago. Though I might look older than he is, I think he's looking hale and hearty more than I am. My thanks to Rupali and Anuj, who have now taken this initiative to a very interesting level, and hope that this goes from strength to strength. My talk, I will base it on my research and on my practice, and also in terms of the region that we live and practice in especially the tropics of South Asia, and I will try to show some insight into these aspects. Firstly, context. In terms of context, we know that we live in the tropics. The tropics are very unique, and therefore the way we live and where we design and where we build varies. Is unique in its approach. We have a variety in the tropical region, but yet the commonality exists is that most of the year we are warm, that is more than 18 degrees Celsius in the tropics, and then we have variations due to the monsoon, etc. So in this sense, the challenges that we have to face, and therefore the opportunity and the uniqueness that we will generate in our building, it comes from this tropical climate that we experience. One thing is high humidity. High humidity means that it is makes us the principal means of thermoregulation for us, that is evaporative heat loss. It makes it very difficult. So therefore, how do we design and live with that in mind? We also know that the macro level winds, because of the intertropical convergence zone passes over us twice a year. In that sense, with the doldrums coming in, the word that we usually use is the doldrums, where winds are non-existent. Again, wind movement is very important for thermoregulation, but without winds, designing with and without winds is a challenge. Also, because of year-round incidence of the solar, we get solar radiation almost right throughout the year, and therefore variations are very minimal. Right? The sun is always high in the sky for us. It gives us opportunities, but also very little variations. Therefore, no seasons. So and then air temperature is almost always high. And the fourth element, high enthalpy. Again, because of the solar radiation and high humidity, it leads to high enthalpy. Thus, we need to be comfortable, high energy need, and therefore that has significant repercussions. From the larger context, then we look at the local and the global climatic changes. We know that the world is warming, and therefore the way we build again has to be thought about for the future as well. You know, the future that is warmer than today. Warmer, it is now is warmer than yesterday. So therefore, what do we do? And mainly the most prominent is haphazard urbanization. Because of urbanization, cities are getting warmer. This phenomenon is usually called urban heat island, where the city is several degrees warmer than the suburbs and the rural areas. This also gives us an opportunity in handling the urban heat island, or looking at the urban heat island as a place to make good. Then we can ameliorate the warming scenarios of the future. As Professor Dayaratne also mentioned, now the tropical area is developing very fast, and mega cities are will be mostly in our region. And also another thing is that all these mega cities of the future will come in tropical zones. Yes, are also currently poor. So therefore, we must make any decisions made must be very done very carefully. This graph on the right-hand side, you can see that where the earlier megacities are being replaced by megacities in the Asian region, and rapidly. So with these megacities, we know that the cities are a driver of climate. So from the global level to the local level or the urban level, we need to take heed of. So because when the global climate is warmer, the effect to the urban climate is also clear, and vice versa, where the local climate also, the way the local and the regional level climates react will affect the global climates. So this gives us a need, and especially in terms of urban climate as an opportunity to stop the rapid development of global climate. And therefore, how do we design our cities? How do we make sure that these cities don't drive the global climate to higher levels? So therefore, the challenges to creating these conducive urban outdoors, especially in terms of urban outdoors that are conducive for passive design in the tropics. We design without minimization of energy. That is very important. So therefore, how do we decouple the conventional resource use? And of course, its corollary, waste generation. You know, how do we remove these two elements, which are a vicious cycle? You know? So our urban areas are getting warmer. We will use more energy to be comfortable, and the energy we use has waste, and that will drive the temperature up in cities. So how do we decouple these things? In that sense, with the population being urbanized and human activity concentrated in urban areas, how do we plan our settlements to be sustainable? And therefore, the incorporation of sustainability into planning is essential, right? If it not done yesterday, we have to do it today immediately, right? There is no waiting for tomorrow. This aspect of bringing sustainability into planning is extremely important, and is very much a part of the urban planning and design domain. So though we have to have many stakeholders or stakeholders from policy to practice, the marriage of all these elements are essential. To explain this, I will take an example from the city, and here in terms of city, we will talk about the microclimate. Right? So most of our South Asian region, we will depend on passive design or natural light, natural ventilation for our living spaces, to make ourselves thermally comfortable, to be able to live outside, which is more prevalent than living inside, as Professor Dayaratne also pointed out. And then, so it is very important. So to do that, to naturally light and naturally ventilate our buildings and our living spaces, we need to take steps, and especially in the microclimate. So to look at this microclimate, my research and a lot of people in the world right now are using this classification system. It's called local climate zone classification system, and it looks at the micro scale. That means the microclimate, the three-dimensional morphological spaces of a city that will impact how we build, how we live, how we use the outdoors, etc. To explain the local climate zone, the local climate zone came about because if we know what is urban heat island, that is the difference between the urban and the rural, the classification of what was urban and what was rural seemed to be very different for different people in different regions, etc. So therefore, the scholarship or the analysis of the urban heat island was ambiguous. So therefore, Stewart and Oak looked at a way of how everybody in the world can come onto one page in terms of reporting urban heat island impact, and also in terms of strategies going forward. So you can see on the right hand side, so the urban was broken down into patterns of building types and land cover types. If you take the old definition, it is urban and rural. But here the urban is recognized for its differences, and the rural or the land cover types is recognized for its differences. So here, instead of urban to rural temperature difference, here it becomes the temperature difference between local climate zones, which have characteristic geometry, land cover that creates a physical as well as climatic. So in defining a local climate zone, you are defining climate as well as physical properties. So all aspects that we would look into when we are planning settlements. As an example, I will take Colombo, Sri Lanka. I won't introduce Colombo, Sri Lanka. I think this slide is just to give you a glimpse of where Colombo, Sri Lanka is. So the task was to map Colombo, Sri Lanka in terms of local climate zones, and then see what is the urban heat island intensity impacts of these different morphologies created by the local climate zone. So in that, you can see this graph on the left-hand side, and the map on the right-hand side. We can see that the more compact and dense elements are warmer, You can see the compact high-rise, any buildings that are more than 25 meters and compact in its in its morphology. We can see that it is warmer, right? So we can say that if it is dense and compact, those areas in the city are warmer, and we can see that when the density is reducing and the packing of the buildings are getting far apart, we can see that it is getting cooler. And this is a map of in 2018. So the city of Colombo is mostly compact low-rise, compact mid-rise, and large low-rise. So that means still our cities or Colombo is not so bad, you know. So there is still opportunity. Then going forward, we looked at what would happen. Colombo is developing fast, and there are development plans. Right? One such development plan is the UDA plans for 2030. Right? So we mapped that. So we looked at the projected local climate zone. That means if everybody builds, theoretically, if everybody builds to the maximum, what would be the UHI intensity? So the map on the right gives the classification of these plots that can be built. And then we can see that according to our planning laws and regulations, most of the city can go high rise. Right? So going high rise meaning the lower densities become higher densities. And then in the graph on the left hand side, we can see left hand side bottom, we can see what the impact is. You know, so once this is the temperature difference, what was and what the temperature or the urban heat island intensity, what will be if it is developed to the maximum. So we can see that we have to be worried. You know, we can see that if the lightweight low rise, the open low rise, and the large low rise areas are all built to the maximum and they go compact high rise, we can see that the city is going to be much warmer. You know, and then we have to be worried about that. We also can see another aspect, such that the already developed areas, that is the upper part of the graph, when developing the already developed or already built areas or already dense areas, if we earmark them for further development, the difference is not much. So that's almost like taking on a grey field site or a brown field site, where already a damaged site or already built site, already generating urban heat island. If we develop it more, there is not as much impact. So that is something to think about. So taking this as an example, so that we can see the two maps, if it is 2018, and if everybody builds to the maximum, if Colombo is extreme, becomes a mega city or a megapolis, as it was coined in the last few years, we can see the impact on urban heat island. And then what we have to think about, is this what we want? How can we make sure that it doesn't happen such? And what are the steps, rules, regulations, policy, etc., that we can adopt to make this good for the future? So with this, I will go away from the city and the urban areas. And Rupali, Professor Gupta wanted me to show some of my work, so I will now look at sharing some of my work with you. And then also, it's not on the urban or the city scale, but it is on the dwelling scale. And I will try to share some of my work. So in terms of my view of building in the tropics, we know that Sri Lanka has a rich tradition, and the climate aspects of it is very much embedded into what we do. Climate and context is very important. And in terms of can we look at this or keep the ideas of climate and context when we are building in the contemporary sense? And then can we adopt technology that is for us, and materiality that is for us, rather than looking at other contexts uh, to derive from. And then in terms of passive design, can we design with light and ventilation, and so that when we build in this context and a specific place, each building will have a very specific response and therefore identity. On architectural space, my feeling is that space making should be very simple and down to earth. It has to be living friendly because we build for people, not as objects, not as artifacts, rather than spaces for living. So therefore, timeless, functional, affordability is important in my practice. And then spaces that use materiality in terms of, so that it's not a nostalgic or just what was used. Here we look at materials, even though it is rustic, unfinished, or untreated, it's not meant to be that. It's rather to connect with the rhythms of the natural environment and create good vibrations, and then therefore spaces that nurture and nourish the soul. So I will draw some examples now from different contexts and different aspects to the design approach. The first project, it's in the heart of Colombo, Colombo 5, and we can see the context is extremely congested, and the site itself is very small. It's less than 150 square meters, or less than 6 perches, which is the minimum area allowed to build in Colombo. So regulation says you can't build on less than 6 perches or 150 square meters. So this is the bare minimum. So my reaction to that was, in terms of a dwelling, how do we zone these areas so they can have elements that are important for living, that is open space, be it garden or gathering spaces, and then sleeping spaces, etc. So in that sense, the separation of the building plot, or how the building plot was zoned, was not horizontal but rather vertical. So the first decision was to raise the garden to the uppermost level, and this whole element, because it's a small plot, to be protected by an envelope, a protective envelope. So this is the building in context. So we can see that the small plot is almost fully built in terms of the envelope, but internally spaces open up. So therefore, it allowed situations where all the spaces, internal spaces, could open out to the outside, where the foregoing the constraints of a very tight site. Planning wise, we can see that the lower level is totally open, and then you have the living spaces. The intermediate level is the sleeping spaces, but still can be opened up so that the lower, the middle, and the upper can connect. And the uppermost level is garden. It is this garden that connects with the city. So in usual tradition or usual manner, living street will connect on the lower level. You will connect with the street on the lower level. Here, without that divide of that opportunity here, we connect with the city on the outside on the upper level. Is another view of it, where the whole space opens up. Even from the lower levels, we can see sky. here. So their vistas are borrowed vistas, where it is the sky and the landscape beyond that becomes their garden. So the central space or central open space connects in terms of climate sensitivity. It creates a stack, a ventilation stack that can draw out all the air up and out. And also in terms of interconnectivity, all spaces connect through this space. So therefore, the space also flows. The light is brought in from the top, and therefore bathes the whole space. So passive measures where constrictions of small site are have been overcome. In terms of materiality, you can see that it is very low embodied energy materials have been used, timber, and also very lightweight. So these, without only the envelope is heavy, and the internal elements are kept very light, glass and timber. Another view, and then you can see the importance of the staircase that connects. And from the outside becomes a protective envelope. So therefore, it allows in a very urban area where there are security concerns also in this area, that it helps the, we can open out a window without being worried, and we can get light and ventilation without having constraints for privacy and security. The second project, term Solus Otus, it is again a residence in the capital city, Jayawardenepura. In terms of context, this is a larger site, and it is, though it is pretty built up in a built up areas, it is not as bad as the first one. So we can think of opening up our facade to the outside. In terms of planning, we can see that there are two wings. That means two wings that form a T. And at the lowermost area, the living areas are oriented north-south, and the sleeping areas are oriented east-west. And we can see that each of these spaces, using thin spaces, open up to open spaces on two sides all the time. This is the upper level, where we'll have the sleeping spaces, and then the north-south wing, or the living room or the living spaces at the lower level, become a garden at the upper level. To the outside, this envelope seems pretty closed. So though we are using a brick screen or a trellis screen, jali in Indian terms, or bamboo tacks and grills for the doors, it seems pretty closed up, but it is not actually. When we look from inside, it becomes quite transparent, but still keeping these layers so that the internal privacy and security can be maintained. So this external envelope, open-closed external envelope, opens up into pockets of green. So these green pockets become little microclimates that allow spaces to open up both ways, allowing cross ventilation, shading, vegetation and evaporative cooling, etc. So this is the entrance court. You can see that it is a layering of spaces, so that it doesn't open up directly onto the boundaries, or the boundaries are layered so that spaces, in between spaces are created. Similarly, on the other side, we can see that transitional spaces, so staircases, etc., have this transparency, and when needed can be opened up so that the outside can come in and the inside can come out, still be protected. As we can see, baby in her pantry, but still she's protected from the garden, and then with the envelope, the world outside. Staircase. So when needed, these spaces open up. So completely it becomes almost a pavilion where the inside is bought, the outside is bought in, and the inside spills outside. So it becomes one complete continuous space, and the connection to natural elements are very important here. Another view. On the upper level also we mimic this, or we replicate this, where upper level garden also becomes a connection, so that again garden spaces, green spaces can come inside the house, and then you can just walk onto a garden space. And it's very important for the inhabitants, where even on the upper levels you seem to be in the garden itself. And the gardens were planted with indigenous fruit trees. So therefore, there are squirrels and birds that can help. And then also it was meant to be lived in and meant to be spilled outside and used outside. So the connections were very important here. The third project is outside of Colombo, again on a larger plot. So the approach here was to, this is if you can say that it is a space outside Colombo, outside the urban areas. So how do I interpret this situation where the main element in a house, that is the roof and the building envelope itself, how do we design it? How do we make it contemporary but still keep the essence of a house with a large veranda, large garden, etc. So my approach to it was to look at the envelope as a not as separate elements of roof and walls, columns, etc. Rather to think about the building envelope as a continuous element. Therefore, how will it wrap? How this envelope will be in terms of now say this is a two-story house. So with a large roof, how do we make it prominent? How do we make it part and parcel of veranda and living spaces? The site itself is was a quite a wooded site or a planted site, and the space that we used was the footprint of the old house. So nowhere did we cut a tree that was not was there already, and then we reused the footprint of an already used space. So it's a sloping site, so we can see that though this is the upper level, when we are approaching this the house, the envelope is predominant, yes, but still broken up, separated by the vegetation around. This is the veranda, and the entry is on a lower level. So the interpretation of the veranda becomes quite different, where we don't have columns, etc. It is this envelope, extended envelope, that creates these spaces. And this house doesn't have a front and a back. So it's a completely a three-dimensional space where all sides are connected. This is the opposite to the, I won't say rear side, but opposite to the entry. So we can see that the roof comes right to the floor, and then we vary certain things. Here again is a transitional space. The staircase, we can see that the terracotta tile roof is brought right down, and it used to enclose spaces. These are some details that we can see how the envelope is part of the structure itself, and just it flows without having differentiation of elements. And of course, we are using very natural materials and local materials. So the interior feel is also the same. So the roof or the envelope, from what we usually see, are blurred. So we are bringing the roof down to levels to shade. Rather than a eave, it becomes a vertical elements and so forth. So all those elements are questioned and re-derived. This last project, termed Earthship, is an experiment in materiality. Again, we come back to the suburbs of Colombo, Navala, and we were fortunate to have a waterfront site. So the site abuts the Dayaratne, the tributary of the Dayaratne lake that the Parliament of Sri Lanka sits on. And so the site is quite a large site. So the approach here was to take it in smaller elements, so to break up the bulk of the element so that we don't block the water from the roadside. And similarly, it is oriented to the east and the west, so that the view to the east is important. So we have not, though it is not very conducive for heat gain reduction, we have used that for architectural effect. These are the layout plans. And here the main thing in terms of materiality was to use the earth. Now this was a pretty bad in terms of bearing capacity. You would expect that being it on the lakefront. So we had a situation where soil consolidation was necessary, and we have to use piles, and that generated a lot of earth that we had to dig up. The client knew this, but he was happy to be on the waterfront as opposed to to find a better site with a better soil quality. So what we see here is completely of the soil. So we can see the ground and the walls are all of the same color because it is the same earth. Here we are using a technology called mud concrete. It is in situ cast, but the base is mud concrete. This is developed by architect Dr. Rishna Arus, also my student at the university, but now she's a PhD was that, where she explored how to grade the soil and to build off it. So in terms of climate sensitivity in this thing, these elements are very thin, though we are, unlike if we went for rammed earth and such, the thickness of the wall is minimal. It is kept to 150 millimeters. Still, because of the thermal qualities of the earth and the earth wall, it keeps the spaces very, very cool. And because of that also, we have to have, because of the soil conditions, we have a very thin concrete structure as the load bearing element. And then we have these infill walls in the earth of the land itself. And going further, we also, so the main idea was to reduce as much embodied energy in building. right? So we are building passive. We are using the local materials that are on site and using minimal materials from the outside. And also we are trying to reuse. This is a view from the waterfront. You can see that the three elements step back with the water, and then the space is raised up so that the volumes can breathe. So so we are trying to reuse some elements. These are bottles, as you can see. It not only reuses certain materials, but also creates unique lighting patterns in the internal spaces. This is the same space in the evening. So you can see that the texture, color, feel of the ground, even the floor is simply cut. There is no finishing. There is no finishing layer here. It is the material and the material alone. So the idea again is to look outside. So from these spaces to open up as much as possible to the very interesting and cooling, very pleasurable outside environment. So each space has a unique view, and then we try to frame it as with least disturbance as possible, and to connect with the outside and the inside to the outside and the outside to the inside as much as possible. So with this project, I will now stop, and thank you for the opportunity for letting me show some of my research and also some of my work, and I welcome questions going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Narein, for this talk. And Professor Dayaratne, if you can switch on your video, we can start the. So I request the viewers to put in their questions in the question and answer session. I'll start the conversation, but I already see one question up there, and we'll get to it soon. I'll begin with Professor Dayaratne. I think very interesting talk. Very systematically, sort of, you've laid out this idea of the vernacular, and you sort of place these two, the idea of the rural vernacular and the idea of the urban vernacular. I think at some other time it will also be interesting to sort of delve into the urban vernacular and sort of look at how you sort of place that. But you sort of concentrated on the idea of the rural vernacular. And I think one particular thing that I have two questions there. One particular interesting aspect that I saw is the way you sort of located the idea of worldviews, where you sort of located this idea of the fragility of life, right? Like the idea of the rural vernacular located within the worldview that believes in the fragility of life. And what actually, in some ways, that is a very important way of looking at things, because in some ways, the idea of permanence, and not a fragility of life, but the idea of permanence came with the idea of the colonial worldview, right? Like the idea that everything has to be permanent, it has to last forever, you know. And in some ways, we see this also continued in the modern logics of thinking, right? Like the idea of modernity also in some ways brought in this idea of permanence. And often we see today in our building codes, in the way I mean, at least we see that in India, that within bureaucracy and building codes is located the same spatial logic of the colonial mindset or the modern mindset, which looks at the idea of permanence.
Yeah.
And often the idea of the rural vernacular is seen as something then that is impermanent, and hence not something that is desirable. And so we see that in several of our own sort of policies, that when the government has to fund something, the kind of rebuilding of settings like this, they are seen as what is called kacha, or the impermanent. And so you will not get funds for rebuilding unless you build with modern materials, you build with things that are more permanent and sustainable. I mean, not sustainable, sorry, permanent, right?
Yes.
So do you see, I mean, I'm just also, because you've kind of studied the Sri Lankan context closely, do you see this kind of friction that happens in the contemporary context in sort of, looking at these worldviews of the permanent and the impermanent, the modern and the, and the vernacular? Does, because we see that very, very clearly in the contemporary context here. Do you see those frictions existing, and how are those frictions sort of worked out?
Thank you for the question. I think you picked up a very important and interesting point. Yes, the simplicity, the fragility of life and impermanence has been paramount in the vernacular settlements, particularly the rural. And I think it automatically comes into being in the urban by the context and the circumstances rather than being designed. But whether there is a conflict in terms of the current attitudes and values and rules and regulations is a good question. But I think there is and there isn't at the same time. Meaning, I do not know how it happens in all parts of Asia, to be honest, but generally speaking, ourselves being relatively rural, the authorities have different kinds of regulations. The regulations, there are universal regulations that govern the construction of buildings across the country. But at the same time, there are regional institutions which have authority to approve and so on. And not all buildings, interestingly and importantly, not all buildings in the villages and rural areas have to get permission to build. It's only in the urban areas that the buildings need to be designed by professionals, approved by planning committees, and so on and so forth. So the hegemony of the westernized thinking of permanence hasn't necessarily percolated all the way down to the rural regions. And therefore, there is no visible conflict as such manifesting in the current situation. But I can see, as you're saying, as we progress, which within inverted commas defined as moving towards westernization, unfortunately, we haven't discovered any opposite to that, Eastern form of development, which we should. We will be going in that direction, and we will be insisting on a lot more permanence. And there is some value to it also. Some of the materials are, like I said, transformed minimally. Skills are manual mostly. Machines haven't existed, or there hasn't been a desire to construct machinery and transformation of that sort. So, and that came also from the fact that there was no need to build mansions and permanent buildings. Things are slowly changing, and there are two things about it. One of which is the idea that traditional and vernacular building materials and technologies are not permanent is not necessarily true. Now we have, for example, the mud architecture, earth buildings, which uses timber skeletons filled with mud balls, which is called Watlando Warichi. Many buildings in the rural areas have been constructed using this material, this technology, and then plastered with lime and so on. Those buildings have lasted centuries. There are hundreds of years old buildings that have been constructed using Watlando. But like you said, if you apply for construction of a Watlando building now, they won't be approved on the grounds that they are not acceptable, which is based on a misconception rather than reality. But at the same time, there are issues about them. Buildings received good maintenance, and there was a system of maintenance in the rural vernacular settlement that made sure that those fragile materials were constantly kept up annually. There were ceremonies, there were situations, particularly there is a period of leisure that comes into being after the harvesting of the paddy fields and so on. There is a period of lack of serious labor involvement during which comes the New Year festivals. And before the New Year festivals, most of the houses will get repainted, those loose ends will be refixed and so on. So those things don't exist anymore because the society has changed. People are now going to work, looking for government jobs and so on, and people won't have time anymore to be engaged in that. So this attention has shifted. One thing I wanted to talk about is also, despite the fact that I created a very beautiful picture about the vernacular, it is not necessarily the case right now, because transformations are happening. There are changes, there are tremendous changes that are happening, and there are big transformations, and that is natural. But what I would like to say is that there is a misconception about the fragility of the materials and impermanence of it, which is not true. But at the same time, there are issues of maintenance that needs to be brought in, and there are possibilities of applying far more sophisticated new technologies that can improve upon those traditional vernacular technologies. One example is the mud itself. Now, wattle and daub lasts hundreds of years, but adobe buildings last longer as well. But now there are improved stabilized earth blocks, which are using mud, which has a derogative identification and terminology. And for that reason, people don't like to build with mud. But now we are using the word earth technologies, and earth technology has produced bricks that can be used to construct buildings without any mortar. And those kinds of buildings are being now even constructed in urban areas. I have built 1 or 2 buildings in Colombo using earth blocks, and I know architects in Colombo who are doing buildings with earth blocks. So technologies need to be supported and reinvented, and there is the base that exists already. What's most important about vernacular is that vernacular has been undeniably sustainable without using the word. This whole idea of sustainability as a term and a specialization came into be only recently, but it was inherently sustainable. And if you are now looking for sustainability, we can learn a lot of lessons from the vernacular. And what we need to do is to try and improve those loose ends. But take the case of thatch, the paddy that is being used for roofing structures. I was in England at one point and I discovered that thatch is in fact a luxury material in England. The thatch buildings are very expensive. The Shakespeare's Theatre in London is covered in thatch, and this is being rethatched every now and then. And thatch comes from France. And there are master thatchers there who build it. What happened to our thatch is that we did not develop that technology. We stopped the progression of those technologies in the vernacular at one point, and therefore we did not come all the way. And I think that's where our role exists, where we can, with the people, develop those things and break the potential conflict of permanence impermanence issue, and use the traditional vernacular to sustain the world and keep both culture and development together.
I think that's a very important point you've made, this idea that in some ways we need to think of the vernacular through a contemporary framework, right? Like, how do you actually not look at the idea of the vernacular as something that has stopped in time, but how do you kind of look at the contemporary relevance of it? And with that would be all kinds of things, the current demographies of the vernacular, the shifts, the transformations that are happening, whether the rituals exist, are there transformations in those, and how do we actually then bridge the gap between, the idea of the vernacular that existed and contemporary logics that are operating, and how do we sort of, marry them? I think that is a very, very important point. And I think it would be nice to kind of build the research on South Asia, on that kind of bedrock, right? Like, I think that will be fantastic to sort of see sort of growing in the future. And as you said, there's the idea of, we very easily say the Western way of doing things. Could we very sort of build a kind of robust research where we look at the Eastern way of doing things, or the Southern way of doing things?
Exactly, right? Yes. This is what it's lacking.
That for the contemporary. I think that's a very, very important point. Absolutely. I just want to have one more question for you before I move to Narein, and then there's, I think, a lot of questions waiting for us in the question and answer box there.
Really?
I was just curious about one aspect, because you had such a systematic study. I'm just wondering whether you do not want to question the term vernacular. I mean, especially because you kind of also defined it from this idea of the homeborn slave, and
Yeah.
talking about the idea of the contemporary and all of that. Is it not time to reframe that term itself? Is it possible to sort of somewhere shake because that term also seems to be a colonial term, right? Like,
Absolutely, yes. It is surprising that it came from Latin, and
absolutely.
then it has percolated all the way down. But I think I wouldn't be too involved in the semantics of it, because it's only when you're speaking in English that you use the word vernacular.
Right,
And then if you use your own language, your native language, then we have our own terminologies that are probably sometimes even more meaningful than the vernacular itself. And they don't refer to slaves at all because we never had them. So I wouldn't worry too much about the term vernacular as such, because it's just a language of expression in the English. But you are right. I think it is time that we question that very idea and try and see if we can invent something more meaningful and more appropriate to probably indigenous is more appropriate. There are a lot of terms being used, but vernacular has stuck and it has stayed there. So yes, you are right. I think we can initiate a discussion about that and then come and see how we can reframe it. That's a very good point. There's a lot of work to do.
Yes, yes, we have a lot of work to do in South Asia. But thank you so much. I just have two questions for Narein. I think one sort of again very interesting. You placed your research, which is broader, and then you showed your work. Also very interesting work. So I'm like, one question is, how do you sort of bridge the two, right? Like, how do you bridge your research and how do you bridge the idea of the building scale and the city scale? What happens when, and you showed us this very interesting map, where you kind of looking at the idea of local climate zones and showing us what will happen, to urban heat islands when the city densifies. And so how do we, and you also have a kind of strategy of working at the building level, right? But these buildings are smaller, they're single family homes. What happens when cities densify? Is it possible to kind of think of the kind of building logics that somehow talk to that scale? How do you see that idea, the future of the city from the perspective of sustainability?
Yeah. Thank you, Rupali. That's a very interesting question and uh, an important question. I think the most important part of it is that whatever we do, I think we have to make informed decisions. Right. So the decision-making process, even from the micro scale, from the domestic to the neighborhood, to the precinct, to the city, to the world, we to the country, to the world, we need to think of those at all those levels. So anything that any decisions that we make must come with that. So here, where policy and regulation, and in terms of so not in terms of the negativity of those things, right? So why once uh, those decisions need to be taken as a whole rather than by part. So the domestic elements cannot be removed from the city elements, from the regional elements, from the local elements, etc. So this local climate zone becomes a in-between part. So it uh, addresses the global scale because it's looking at the urban heat island, and also in terms of the drivers of urban heat island, how we build on the smaller scale. So in making, people need to make informed decisions. So and then we also have a situation, the local climate zone. What one important factor is that we don't make blanket decisions. That means one rule cannot apply for all areas of a city, etc. So we have to take it part by part, precinct by. So that's why local. So we recognize that the local has to have special consideration and not overall rules. So most of the time we see these planning regulations and etc. Are the same for the coastline plots, and it is the same for the inner city plots, etc. No? But we know that with the changing orientations of the street, changing adjacent, if it is adjacent to the ocean, is it adjacent to natural park areas, natural vegetated areas, it changes. So therefore, uh, strategies that recognize these things. Hopefully that answers your
That's,
question.
I think architects in Sri Lanka have a big role to play once this kind of idea of densification starts, and you've shown us where it could lead to. So, in some ways, I think that will be important to kind of look at how that bridging happens. And yeah, you've answered the question there. I think just one more regarding that. Like, I think I also read in your bio that you're a team member for the development of the energy efficient building code for Sri Lanka. I'm curious again, if there are any new building codes for, sustainable materials in urban areas. Is there something that we could learn from in terms of sort of looking at building codes in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so very much so. I think again here, Rupali, so we have just finished a revision of the energy efficient building code, and just last week we have been able to present it to the Urban Development Authority, and which they will incorporate. So again, the situation is, rather than specifying certain materials, we leave the performance aspect of it. If we define the performance of the code, and then let people innovate, right? So it is very important that we don't curtail development, we don't curtail innovation, we don't curtail new thinking, etc. So the importance is that we need to establish thresholds, and important thresholds for people to live comfortably, or while not using energy to live comfortably. So the to break that cycle of more energy for comfort. So it's things like so even in the building code, we go with thresholds, so that achieving on the thresholds and the energy targets are open. So you can use innovation, materials, new ways of using materials, and still uh, achieve those targets. That's a very important step that we have taken.
That will be very nice for us to kind of also look at your suggestions, and we stay in touch with you, because I think there's a lot to learn, and which is why the discourse in South Asia is important, because it's also important to share some of the new work that is sort of happening. So I think in both your cases, we would be really, really sort of happy to stay in touch with you in kind of the development of your own research, and sort of exchange some of the things that we've been also thinking about. So I'm going to move to the question and answer session, because there's a lot of questions here.
Right.
The first question is to Narein. My question is for Perera sir. In your birdcage project, how do you manage? Have you managed to put vernacular aspect in the house? However, in my perspective, it's look okay. He's asking you how do you think the birdcage is vernacular, or how do you kind of look at the idea of system?
No, it was not a practice in the work vernacular. My work doesn't just draw directly from the vernacular. Rather, it is place specific or climate specific answers. So that even though it is the essence, basically we are trying to react to a certain context, and in those decisions, the answer or the solution in terms of architecture will differ, and then the difference is welcome. We try to make a difference, but still keep the essence of what we are trying to do. I think that is main thing. It is not a direct derivation of vernacular. I think that is the.
And you didn't mention that. Ranjith Perera is asking again, Narein, in the last house that you designed, what were the construction cost and energy implications vis-a-vis a typical suburban house?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ranjith Perera, also another one of my teachers, I think contemporary of Dr. Dayaratne as well.
Junior to me.
Yeah. So, yes, in terms of cost, because we are using the same materials on site, I think the major impact or the cost factor was the labor. It is labor heavy. It was labor heavy to use because we have to, the soil is not taken vis-a-vis, it has to be processed. And I think the costs are there. In terms of cost in comparison, I think that we have a reduction in cost in terms of materiality and etc. And in terms of energy, of course, we have a huge advantage over a normal wall. Now, even we see two elements here. We see the mud wall and we see the concrete supporting structure. So when you're inside, if you keep your palm onto the concrete, which is the same thickness, the concrete is also 150 millimeters thickness. The soil wall is also 150 millimeters. If you keep, say, your left hand and your right hand, you can see a huge difference. In terms of energy, I think I forgot to mention that all 4 projects that I just showed you are net zero energy. And we have been able to keep the zero energy by solar and also by passive means. So in terms of energy, of course, there's a huge saving.
I think there's one more question that asks, do you use websites or softwares to determine site analysis like wind or sun path? How about for determining contours in the lot?
Yes, so when it calls for, we do use. So even for our urban studies, yes, of course. So software. So if I mention some, I think one of the major software that we use on the urban scale is called NVMet. NV as in ENVI, small hyphen MET, MET, NVMet. And so that is on the urban scale. On the building scale, of course, there are many. So and then here in terms of design, we will design in terms of architectural space making, etc. While keeping in mind and while keeping our knowledge of the context, etc. in mind. And then we will use verification. If we need, we will use verification, and then also we will use post-occupancy evaluation when it calls for.
The next question is for Professor Dayaratne. It says, learning from the communal idea of vernacular spatial order, how can we begin to imagine this for urban contexts where ideas of property and individual ownership exist?
I didn't understand the question. Idea of?
The question is that I think in the urban context, we have ideas of property and individual ownership as opposed to the communal, right? Like the idea of the commons in rural contexts. So they're asking you, how is it possible to use some of those ideas in the urban context? Some of the ideas that have come from the vernacular and some of the values that you kind of, also point out. Is it possible to think about some of them in the urban context, particularly when there is the idea of private property and individual ownership?
Right. Yes, I think there are 2 things about it. The nature of the vernacular in the rural did not necessarily depend on the ownership the property itself. To a certain extent, ownership to the property does exist. It is not entirely absent. It is not communal property ownership either. But there is more commonality and sharing between these properties. And, you won't construct big boundary walls, for example, around a vernacular house in the rural area. That never happens, whereas in the city it does. So in the urban, yes, individualism has become overemphasized and the separation has come into being. Those changes exist, but what you can learn from vernacular is not about ownership. It is not about the communalities, which is a completely different spatial order. It is not possible, perhaps, I think one thing that we need to understand is that it is not possible to reimpose a social order or any of the characteristics of any situation to another situation without adapting to the new situation. What we can learn from the vernacular is about the way in which the building, the spaces individually designed and related to the immediate surroundings and the use of materials and so on and so forth have been exceptionally well articulated in the vernacular. If the communal relationship cannot be, then of course we cannot. We have to abandon that particular facet. There are facets that can be adapted. There are facets that cannot be, because vernacular was not necessarily urban. But then having said that, I would also like to draw attention to the fact that the concept that urban is somehow Western and modern is also not true. There are settlements in Africa, in Yemen and so on, and where people have lived in very close proximity to each other. High density is a characteristic of urbanity. They have lived in very close quarters, very high density settlements, out of desire to do so rather than by compulsion of having a shortage of land and so on and so forth. So there are situations where urban characteristics have existed in the vernacular settlements from where one can learn lessons for constructing the contemporary urban situation. So you need to find right examples from where to learn. I think it will be difficult to find examples from a location which doesn't share the right kind of characteristics to be reinvented into a different situation. So that is the point about it. And then again, of course, we need to understand that things are changing. So like I'm saying, in the urban developments, one needs to create new conceptual frameworks that can adapt certain practices of the vernacular, which have very positive contributions that can be made to spatial definitions. But they are not there necessarily in the historical traditional vernacular. I did not take this point in my presentation. There is another division that we can talk about in the vernacular, even in the rural or in the urban. There is this idea of historical vernacular, the vernacular that has existed in the past, and there is contemporary vernacular, the vernacular that exists in the present. They are not exactly the same because nothing is permanent. Like I said, it changes. Historical vernacular is different from the contemporary vernacular. What is happening in the rural villages today is not exactly what happened hundreds of years ago. So you need to know and figure out from which situation, from which circumstance, could you really learn and borrow lessons for urban situations. There are situations from which it can be done.
Hiranti has a similar question for you. How could we, one second. Yeah, how could we use the sense of vernacular thinking in the modern city? I think it's a similar question, if you want to add anything to it. And I must also kind of here thank Hiranti, because Hiranti also kind of introduced us to the two of you. So yeah, I'll just take the opportunity here to thank Hiranti. And if you want to also kind of have anything else to add to her question?
Yes, Hiranti, hi. Thank you for the question. Sense of vernacular in the contemporary modern is It's a difficult question because one needs to ask the question, what do you mean by really sense of vernacular? Because vernacular is not one thing. It is something that you choose as to what you want it to be, in the sense that there are different things about vernacular. There is, well, like I said, it's about worldviews. If you do harness similar worldviews, then you could borrow those worldviews no matter whether you are in the city or you are in the village. If you look at the materials in a certain way, it is a way in which you look at the materials. And if you want to use the materials, and if you look at the materials in the way that this vernacular settlements did, you could do that in the city no matter whether you are surrounded by other buildings or not. So which facet of that vernacular is what you think defines predominantly the sense of vernacular that you want to reinvent in the city? And you need to choose that first. And if you do that, then I think it will be possible to articulate that using contemporary ideas, which I think many people have been doing. Like, for example, I mean, we know, for example, what Jeffrey Bawa did was to reinvent the vernacular traditional architecture of Sri Lanka into the modern contemporary situations of the tourist hotels. It was never, I mean, vernacular settlement never constructed tourist resorts or buildings of that nature. But then he was able to exact the essence of some of the characteristics of the vernacular and traditional architecture and reinvent and redeploy them for completely different situations. So it needs understanding which facet of that vernacular you want to bring into the urban. Urban is simply a question of living in high density quarters in small spaces, a close proximity, and that's the only difference. And the absence of nature that is predominant, because the rural had that great luxury of being presented by the nature predominantly around it. But those can be created, those can be reinvented. And that's, I think, that's how you could bring the sense of vernacular into the city. That's what I think.
So there's a question again from Professor Ranjith Perera asking, how difficult was it to convince your client on your usage of material and experimentation?
Me, is it?
Yeah, I think it is for you.
Yeah. So, yeah, so that's also important factor that the project or the client, consultant, contractor, or the team is one entity. I think that is an important factor in my work, that you can see that I'm allowed to, or allowed to innovate, allowed to use materials differently, etc. Because of the factor that everybody is on, most of the time, I will say most of the time, on one page. And also in terms of the way of living, no? So they have to buy in. They have to be sold by me, and they have to buy into a situation where they would welcome such a move, rather than me imposing myself uh, on a client. The concurrence and the need for the client to buy in is important. And also this kind of idea also generates with the client, with the client's needs, and how the client wants to use the spaces, etc. That comes from that also. So the answers are not alien, though they might not think that this is the answer to what they were thinking of in the first place, but they welcome it in the long run. Yes, there are problems. Of course, that is understandable, but sometimes, most of the time, it's what the client likes, and so therefore it's not a difficult sell at the end. Hope that answers your question.
I think Hiranti is asking you a similar question what I had asked you. How could your research be used for future cities in which we could increase density but maintain the advantages of the tropical climate? If you want anything to add to it, because I know you.
Yes. So one thing is now something that came from what Professor Dayaratne just mentioned in replying Hiranti. So when we so the crux of the statement was, don't build or regulations in terms of a blanket trip. So if we build everywhere the same way, then we'll run into problems. So recognize certain areas of the city that we can build, and then control other areas. So the problem that comes with that is social justice, equity. Sorry. So some people can build high rises, some people cannot. How do you balance that? Are there rates and taxes less, etc. Even now we have a situation where we have plots that we cannot build, and certain areas of the city that we cannot build as similar to the others. In my opinion, that's a good thing, and that's a way to go. So some areas can be high density. In those high density areas, we can take measures to keep it sustainable, keep it climate sensitive. And in other areas also, we have to do the same thing. We have to keep it sustainable, but yet the way we do it can change. So that's the way, in my opinion, that's the way to go. And then by defining a local climate zone, you can quickly, without going into very deep analysis and simulations and etc., we can take informed decisions quickly using this kind of morphological mapping. Hopefully that answers your question, Ira.
And it'll be interesting to see building development regulations that are doing that in various places, because often it is about private property and the kind of building rights you get on your plot, right? So who can give up their rights and who doesn't? I think there's several complex questions around that. So it'll be interesting to see where some of these are implemented. So I'm just going to move on because there are 3 more questions. This is for Professor Dayaratne. Here we see Narein decide to raise a mud concrete house on short stilts. We don't see this approach in vernacular domestic architecture of Sri Lanka, even in the wet zone. Instead, we often see raised plinths in both floodplains and dry plains. What could the reason be? I think this idea that we don't see vernacular architecture which is raised on short stilts, even in wet zones. Is there a reason for that?
I'm not sure how to answer that question, really speaking. I think it could be to do with insects attacks because most of the buildings used timber, and the idea of foundations and digging into ground and dealing with these issues probably did not exist at that time sufficiently complex enough to deal with those situations. That could be one of the reasons why it would have been elevated. But then there could have been many other reasons why they were elevated. It is very difficult to say why some buildings have been raised up without really knowing what those buildings and where they existed. I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer that question.
Yeah. So again, there's another question for Professor Dayaratne about courtyards. Have you observed any similarities or differences in building courtyard spaces in terms of its spatial character, its materiality, the activities performed in urban and rural settings? So are courtyards different spatially and materially in urban and rural settings?
Yes, I think there are tremendous differences in courtyards across. Courtyard is a very common kind of spatial entity that has come into being in the Asian region and in the Middle East and Gulf as well. There are courtyards in this region as well. The Arabic houses all have courtyards. But these courtyards are very different. In the Asian region, there are courtyards. Any open space in the middle of a building has been utilized, I think, primarily for private activities, for spaces that can be used for controlled access and family in enclosure, but in still outdoors and so on. So there is a wide variety of courtyard spaces that exist. In some regions where the climate is not conducive, you would have courtyards with water in it so that you create a microclimate in that space. So it depends on the purpose, it depends on the location, it depends on the families themselves as well, and for what purpose these courtyards have been actually constructed. So there is a cultural practice that comes into being that originally, of course, comes into being as a result of the geography of the land, fashioned by the climate, and then, of course, the social factors that comes into being. So there are wide variety of courtyards, and there is a huge difference between one and the other, and it's difficult to lump them all together as just courtyard houses. No, they are different from one to another.
Okay, so, and this is a question to Narein. What were the methods employed to document the urban heat island effects? Can you share more about the mapping and documentation process?
Yeah, so the protocol was the local climate zone. I think if you search on local climate zone, I think that protocol is well established, and a lot of work is being done at the moment. And another website that you can look at, which is very interesting, the urban climate community tends to share freely. So you can see a lot of work. It's called WUDAPT, WUDAPT, WUDAPT.org, World Urban Database and Protocol Tools. WUDAPT. So that's an initiative to map the whole world in terms of local climate zones, and then look at. So the ultimate idea there is to have a clickable climate sensitive morphology map. You click like Google Earth. It's called GeoWiki. GeoWiki. So you just click, and then you have all the data you will need. So morphological, climatic, etc. With that, you can make informed decisions. That's an important thing. So you design for context. So in that initiative, this WUDAPT initiative is paramount here. So that's an interesting place that you can look, and they will share. I think in India, I think a lot of work is done in Nagpur. I think Rajashree Kotaka, and in Kolkata, Chandana Mitra. I think Rajashree and Chandana have done a lot of work in terms of India in Nagpur and Kolkata.
So, okay, now we've come to our final question. This is for Professor Dayaratne. This is Rishabh Chandan asking, what is the idea of the sacred, and why is it important in sustaining vernacular architecture or vernacular culture? Is it that the sacred is important?
Sacred and the profane, the division of the sacred and the profane have existed in the vernacular, particularly like I've presented in the Sri Lankan context. It has very, very clearly existed. And I think it does exist in most other cultures as well. How and why it is important is because I think man exists in a world that is always divided. There is a duality of existence. There is right and wrong. There is good and bad. And, take any conceptual entity, you have an opposition to that. So it is necessary for us as human beings, as we exist, to find an alternative, an opposite, another pole. This bipolarity is part of our presence, our conceptualization. If the world is entirely profane, which is devoid of and rejection of an comparable, different existence of beings and worlds, then I think we have lost one part which harnesses and caresses and holds and nurtures a mystic knowledge and understanding and so on, which we think is beyond us. So we need that beyond to our human existence, which is what sacred is actually, which is what it defines. And therefore, man has constructed, this is my personal view, the man has constructed religions that are the adobe of the other, the opposition to us as profane, ordinary human beings. That is the importance of the sacred, and the sacred needs to exist, and it has always existed, and I think it will continue to exist, whether it is a vernacular or in the city.
Yeah, I think also in your talk, you sort of talked about the idea of the sacred and the profane, but also the idea of the in-between, right? And
Yeah.
there's a lot sort of, there as well, where perhaps we kind of, open up the binaries of the sacred and the profane through this idea of the in-between, which is a very, very interesting, domain.
Sure.
Also kind of open up the idea of South Asian architecture through.
True.
So, with that, I think I will end the session, and I really would like to thank both Professor Dayaratne and Narein Perera for being here and really sort of opening up so many dimensions of architecture, looking at the idea of the vernacular, the idea of the tropical, and sort of our own sort of built environments within that. So thank you so much. I have a few more thank yous to do. I would like to thank the participants for being here. I would also like to thank the Urban Design Research Institute, which partly funds this talk and has been a partner with us for a long time. And all the faculty members, I would like to thank Dipti, Anuj, Dushant, and my other co-conspirators, the trustees along with me, who have set up this little school, which is like it is like a little, it's a co-op actually, because it's run by faculty, it is run by the students, and that's how we like to call it. And also, I think what is important for us to, and this is something that we're learning from this whole series, that we're all trying to build this knowledge of South Asia together. And we would like to stay in touch with you. We're not going to leave you after this talk, but we really would wish to stay in touch with you for your future research, and share our own sort of learnings with you in the future. So if you're okay with that, we will stay in touch with you.
Thank you very much for the great opportunity. It gave me an opportunity to think about the South Asia. I belong there, but I never thought about it in this way until you put this question in front of me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everything, and wish you good luck.
Okay.
My thanks to you, Rupali.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.